And then, just as her thoughts began to spiral, the figure stepped forward. Its breath, icy, unnatural, brushed against her ear. "Do you want to see what lies beneath?" The words slithered through her, sinking into her bones, tightening their grip. Elena felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. She gasped, her body shaking with the effort to breathe, but the cold had stolen her warmth. The figure moved again, closer this time. Elena could feel its presence in the very marrow of her bones, the sharpness of its form pressing against her reality. She had to do something. Her hand shot out, reaching for the floor, where the broken lantern still lay. Fingers trembling, she grabbed for the remnants of the flame, but as her hand touched the cold metal, something stopped her. The light flickered back on bright, blinding. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone again. Everything was dark. Everything was still. And the only thing Elena could hear was the sound of her own breath, ragged and desperate. The figure was gone, but the air around her still felt charged, heavy with the echo of its presence. She didn't dare move. Not yet. Not until she knew it was safe. And that's when the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. "I'm still here." The words sent a jolt of cold terror through her veins. Elena's pulse quickened, her body still paralyzed by fear. But this time, she was sure of one thing. She wasn't alone in the treehouse. The whispering voice swirled around her as if it came from all directions at once. "I'm still here." The words echoed, reverberating in her mind, making her head spin. Elena's skin prickled with a sense of deep unease. She didn't dare move, not even a muscle, for fear that doing so would draw its attention. The room, once familiar, now felt foreign, as if the very walls were closing in. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, howling through the cracks in the wood. For a moment, Elena thought she heard something else, something more distinct, more real. A dragging sound. Heavy footsteps. The unmistakable scrape of something moving across the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it the figure? Was it still there? She didn't dare look, her eyes fixed on the darkness, hoping that somehow, if she stayed still enough, she might escape notice. But the scraping sound grew louder. Closer. It was now just inches from her. Elena's heartbeat raced wildly in her chest, each thump ringing in her ears. The air around her was cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been pulled from a place far beyond the warmth of the treehouse. Her fingers curled into fists, nails biting into her palms as she tried to steady herself. The scraping stopped. A pause. A long, suffocating silence. Then, a deep breath, slow and deliberate. The sound of something or someone breathing right next to her ear. She could feel the chill of it like ice, brushing her skin. Her stomach twisted in horror. Slowly, ever so slowly, she turned her head. The darkness seemed to stretch forever, but through the shadows, she made out a figure. It was crouched low to the floor, just out of the reach of the dim light from the lantern. Its form was distorted, twisted, its limbs too long, too thin. The figure's eyes were wide and gleaming, two hollow pools of darkness that stared straight into her soul. The air felt thick, suffocating. Elena wanted to scream, but her throat had gone dry, her voice trapped. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, it spoke again. A voice like dry leaves in the wind. "Do you see me now?" The words slithered through her, curling around her thoughts, sinking deep into her mind. Her chest tightened, and her heart pounded harder, threatening to break free of its ribcage. The figure moved, closer, inch by inch. Elena tried to back away, but her body wouldn't obey. The ground beneath her feet felt slick, as if something cold was oozing up from the floorboards. It wasn't just the air that was freezing now. Something in the room itself was changing. The shadows seemed to shift, swirling around her, making it harder to breathe. Her eyes widened in terror as she realized what was happening. The treehouse was no longer just a treehouse. It had become a prison, and she was the prey. The figure's smile spread wide, impossibly wide, stretching across its face in a grotesque grin. "You'll never leave," it whispered, its voice sending a shiver down her spine. The darkness thickened, swallowing her whole. The last thing she saw before the world went black were its gleaming eyes, watching her with a hunger that no human should ever know. The darkness swallowed her completely, an overwhelming void where no sound, no light could reach. Elena's thoughts became fragmented, swirling in the cold emptiness. Her breath was ragged, her chest heaving as she tried to make sense of what was happening. But it was impossible. Her senses were muddled, and the terror that gripped her mind felt like it had seeped into her very bones. Time stretched and distorted. Minutes felt like hours, or maybe it was the other way around. The rain came down in sheets, drumming softly against the wooden walls of the treehouse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, mingling with the warmth of a small fire flickering in the corner. Elena pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, curling up on the cozy cot beside the window. The wind howled outside, pushing against the treehouse, making the structure creak and groan as if it were alive. She glanced nervously at the dark forest below, the shadows stretching out like arms reaching toward her. The steady rhythm of the rain should have been soothing, but tonight, it felt different. There was an unsettling quiet in the moments between the thunderclaps. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and she pulled the blanket closer, trying to ignore the feeling of something watching her. Her eyes darted around the room, the flickering shadows playing tricks on her mind. For a moment, she thought she saw a shape move in the corner of her eye. But when she turned, there was nothing. She swallowed hard, willing herself to relax. The rain began to pound harder now, a deafening roar as it collided with the roof. Elena shut her eyes, trying to drown out the noise, but that's when she heard it. A faint tapping sound. It was light at first, almost like a branch brushing against the wall. But then it grew louder. A rhythm, sharp and deliberate. She froze. Her heart began to race. The tapping wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from inside the treehouse. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she strained to listen. The sound stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The fire crackled. She thought she could hear soft footsteps on the wooden floor, faint but unmistakable. She sat up, her pulse thundering in her ears. There was no one else in the treehouse. She was certain of it. Yet the air felt thick, heavy with something she couldn't explain. Her eyes darted to the small ladder leading up to the attic space above. It was the only place she hadn't checked. Her hands trembled as she reached for the lantern on the table beside her. The flame wavered, casting a flickering light across the room. She stood slowly, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Every step felt like it echoed too loudly in the stillness. Reaching the ladder, Elena hesitated. The attic was dark, darker than anything she had ever seen. But something was up there. She could feel it. Taking a deep breath, she climbed up. The air grew colder as she reached the top, the wind outside whispering through the cracks in the walls. And then, a sudden sound. It wasn't just tapping now. It was something dragging, scraping against the floorboards. Her pulse quickened as she peered into the dark attic, barely able to make out the shape that loomed ahead. Something or someone was there. Her eyes widened as the figure slowly turned toward her. Her body froze. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with a silhouette that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes gleamed, reflecting the dim light from her lantern. Elena couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Then it took a step toward her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Another step. Closer. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice trapped. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure lunged. The lantern slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor as darkness enveloped her. Her heart hammered in her chest. Everything went silent. And in that silence, Elena knew she wasn't alone anymore. The silence was deafening. Elena's mind raced, her breath shallow and quick. The darkness around her felt alive, pressing in on all sides. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The figure's presence loomed closer, the air around her growing colder with every passing second. She could feel it, whatever it was, standing just out of reach, its gaze burning through the shadows. Her eyes were wide, straining to make sense of the blackness that swallowed the room. The firelight had long since faded, and now only the whisper of the storm outside reached her ears. A single step echoed in the silence, soft but sharp. Elena's body trembled with fear, her feet frozen to the floor as she tried to fight the terror rising inside her. Then a voice, a low whisper, slipped through the air, barely audible over the howling wind. "You shouldn't have come here." The words seemed to seep into her skin, like a chill that made her blood run cold. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but her body refused to obey. Another step. The figure moved, its shadow stretching across the floor, growing, shifting. Elena's hands gripped the floorboards beneath her, nails scraping against the wood in a desperate attempt to steady herself. But the darkness was too thick, the air too heavy. Her mind raced, scrambling for a way out. The attic door, the one she had climbed through, was right behind her. But she couldn't move. Something in the air held her in place, as if the very atmosphere had conspired to trap her. The air was thick, like she was submerged in something dense, something that didn't belong in the treehouse or in this world. She felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her, and she was floating, trapped in a space where nothing was real. Then, the whispering started again. It was soft at first, like the wind stirring through the trees outside, but it grew louder. The words were barely audible at first, as if coming from the deepest corners of her mind. "You're still here, still with me." The voice coiled around her, tightening, suffocating. Elena wanted to scream, to fight, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe freely. The sound of her own pulse throbbed in her ears, drowning out everything else. And yet, despite the darkness, she could feel it, something creeping closer. The presence. That terrible, inescapable presence. It was drawing near again, slipping through the air like smoke, as though it had always been there, waiting. A cold hand, a touch that sent a shock through her, brushed against her cheek. Elena flinched, her skin crawling at the sensation. She wanted to pull away, but she was rooted in place, frozen in the grip of whatever force was controlling the room. "Let me show you." The voice rasped in her ear, a sound like nails scraping against stone. Her heart skipped a beat. What was it going to show her? Before she could process the thought, the darkness before her began to twist. The air shimmered, warping as if reality itself were unraveling. Shapes formed in the blackness, shapes that twisted and stretched, too unnatural to be real. And there, in the middle of it all, she saw something. A doorway. But it wasn't a door like any Elena had seen. This one was made of shadows, shifting, pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly light. It was as if the doorway itself was alive, breathing. Her eyes locked onto it, drawn by some force she couldn't understand. But when she tried to turn away, to ignore it, she couldn't. Her body wouldn't obey her. She was being pulled toward it, closer, closer, until she was standing at the threshold. The whispering grew louder. "Come, Elena. Come with me." The voice wrapped around her, enticing, coaxing her forward, as if it were calling her home. She felt her legs move without her control. Her body, as if it belonged to something else, took a step toward the door. And then, without warning, the shadows inside the doorway shifted, revealing a dark, hollow shape that seemed to beckon her. Something was inside. Something waiting. Her pulse quickened, but the pull was irresistible. And then, with a jolt, Elena's hand reached forward, touching the cold surface of the door. The moment she did, a rush of frigid air enveloped her, and the shadows seemed to swallow her whole. She gasped as the world around her collapsed into absolute darkness, the last thing she heard being the voice, soft, triumphant, and final. "You're mine now." The coldness wrapped around her, like the embrace of 1,000 icy hands pulling her deeper into the shadows. Elena tried to scream, but no sound came. Her breath was stolen from her, her body completely immobilized. It was as if the very air had turned to stone, locking her in place. The darkness was all-encompassing, pressing in from every direction. She could feel the coldness seep into her bones, sinking deeper, as though it was rewriting her very existence. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it felt far away, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. She couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't escape. Everything was suffocating. The silence was deafening, more oppressive than any sound could ever be. And then, a sudden pulse of light broke through the dark, sharp and blinding. It flickered like a dying candle, casting long, twisted shadows across the void. For a moment, Elena felt a flicker of something. Was it hope? Could she escape? The light wavered, then blinked out entirely, leaving her in total blackness once more. But now, something was different. She wasn't alone anymore. The presence was back, closer this time, surrounding her, filling the space. She could feel it moving around her, its presence thick and heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Then, just as the panic started to rise in her chest, the voice spoke again, clearer now, sharp as a dagger in the quiet. "Do you see what I've shown you?" Elena's mind raced, but no words formed in her mouth. Her body was still, her thoughts fragmented. The shadows seemed to stretch forever, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. And then, a shift, a flicker in the darkness, like something being pulled from another dimension. The figures that had once been mere shapes now solidified before her. They were not human, not anymore. The creatures in front of her were distorted, grotesque forms that had no place in the world she knew. Long, spindly limbs that writhed as if they had a life of their own. Faces twisted in silent screams, mouths gaping wide, but no sound escaped. And there, at the center of it all, was the one that had been watching her from the start. The tall figure, with its gleaming eyes, now stood directly in front of her. Its face was clear, distorted by a smile that stretched unnaturally wide, showing teeth too sharp, too many. It leaned in, its cold breath chilling her to the bone. "You belong to me now," it whispered, its voice slithering into her ear like venom. And as the words settled over her, Elena felt herself break. Something inside her shattered, a thread snapping. The room, the shadows, the creatures, they all converged on her. The grip tightened, and as she was pulled deeper into the void, Elena knew one thing for certain. There was no escape. She was lost, swallowed whole by the darkness that had claimed her. The treehouse was no longer a safe place. It was a tomb. The weight of the darkness pressed down harder, suffocating her with its cold, crushing force. Elena's thoughts felt slow, distant, as if they were sinking into the blackness with her. She tried to claw her way out, but her arms felt like they were made of stone, heavy, useless. The figures circled around her now, their movements slow and deliberate, like shadows dancing in the corners of her mind. Their eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, stared at her with an unnerving, silent judgment. She could feel them watching, always watching, never blinking. The tall figure, the one that had been with her since the beginning, stepped closer, its grin widening with each step. "Don't you understand?" Its voice was like the sound of rustling leaves, the dry scraping of nails on glass. "You never had a choice. You were always mine." Elena's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She wanted to scream, but the words never formed. The darkness around her seemed to grow thicker, suffocating her, pressing in from all sides until there was no room left to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the shadows began to move. They wriggled and twisted, like living creatures, coiling around her limbs, pulling her down deeper. The figures, no longer just shadows, were now fully tangible, their features distorted and grotesque, their bodies bent in unnatural ways. Elena could feel their cold touch on her skin, the slickness of their presence as they dragged her closer to the center of the void. Her heart raced, but it was as if her body was no longer her own. She was being pulled by an unseen force into the depths of the darkness, into a place where nothing made sense. The cold was unbearable. It seeped into her very soul, numbing every part of her until she could no longer feel. But still, she fought against the grip, fought against the pull, fought against the overwhelming sensation that she was losing herself. A deep, resonant voice, almost like a chant, sounded from all around her, echoing in the void. "You're lost. You're mine." It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus, 1,000 whispers swirling around her, closing in from all sides. The figures moved closer still, their hands outstretched, long fingers like claws, eager to claim her. And as the coldness grew, something else began to shift. The darkness didn't feel so much like an absence anymore. It was something more, something that had always been there, something that had been waiting for her. With each second, Elena could feel herself slipping further, her mind dissolving into the black, her sense of self fading away. There was no escape, no way out. She was falling deeper and deeper into a place where time and space no longer existed. And just as she thought she might finally succumb to the darkness, a voice different from the others broke through. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A whisper of hope. "Elena." She strained to hear, her heart pounding in her ears. "Elena, you can fight." It was the faintest flicker of someone reaching out to her. But the darkness was strong. The cold was unbearable. And Elena's strength was fading. With one final breath, she whispered to herself, a last plea for escape. "I don't want to be lost." And then, silence. The silence stretched out, long and suffocating, like the calm before a storm. Elena's mind, still adrift in the void, felt the pull of that faint whisper, the only thread of clarity in the blackness. "Elena, you can fight." It was so soft, so distant, but there was something in it, something that cracked the cold, oppressive grip of the darkness. For the briefest moment, she remembered who she was. Her name, her body, the world outside this suffocating abyss. But the shadows quickly clawed at her, tearing at that fragile thread of consciousness. They were relentless, feeding on her fear, tightening their grip. The cold that surrounded her intensified, creeping into her very bones, as if it were turning her into something other, something that no longer belonged to the light. But still, that whisper echoed in her mind. Fight. It was like a spark in the dark, a tiny flicker of warmth in the freezing night. Her thoughts began to sharpen, clearer now as her body, though still bound by the shadow's grasp, felt a surge of something. A spark. A pulse of energy, faint but real. For a moment, the overwhelming weight of the dark seemed to hesitate, like it wasn't quite sure what was happening. Elena gathered what little strength she had left, forcing her mind to focus. She thought of the treehouse, of the wind, the rain, the world beyond this terrible prison. She thought of the life she had, what she could lose if she stayed trapped here. And then, with every ounce of willpower, she pushed against the shadows. It was like pushing against a wall, hard and unyielding. But she pushed anyway. Her body shook, her muscles screamed in protest, but the spark in her chest burned brighter. For the first time since the darkness had swallowed her whole, she felt something like resistance. The shadows around her shuddered, pulling back just a fraction of an inch. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't lost. And in that moment, the dark thing, the figure that had been at the center of it all, hesitated. It looked at her, its gleaming eyes narrowing, as if it hadn't expected this fight, hadn't expected her to break through. "You think you can fight me?" Its voice rasped, thick with malice, but there was a crack of uncertainty in its tone. "I am the darkness. I am the end." Elena didn't answer. She didn't have to. With one final, desperate push, she broke free from the hold of the shadows, feeling them splinter like glass, breaking apart in an explosion of cold and light. The world around her seemed to shift, flicker, her surroundings slowly coming back into focus. The treehouse, the storm outside, the faint light of the lantern flickering in the corner. She was back. But something had changed. The air still felt thick with the lingering presence of the darkness, but it was fading now. Elena collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, her hands trembling as she clutched the floorboards. She wasn't free. Not yet. But she was alive. And just that was enough. The treehouse seemed strangely still now, the storm outside only a distant rumble, as if the very atmosphere had taken a breath and held it. Elena lay on the cold wooden floor, her body weak, her limbs shaking from the sheer force of her struggle. Her heart was racing, but the darkness, while still present, had loosened its grip, retreating to the corners of her mind like a fading nightmare. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly pushed herself up, her fingers scraping against the floor as if grounding herself to the reality of this place. The lantern, still flickering weakly in the corner, cast an eerie, flickering light over the room, making the shadows dance across the walls. Elena's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, to reassure her that she hadn't slipped back into the nightmare. Her gaze landed on the window, where the rain had begun to subside. Through the misted glass, she could see the branches of the tree swaying gently in the wind, the storm's fury finally easing. For a moment, Elena closed her eyes, letting the sound of the wind and rain become the anchor she needed. She was here. She was still alive. But the memories of what had happened, of the darkness, the whispers, the creatures, still clung to her like a shadow, following her every move. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. Her pulse quickened again, but she forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her. There was no going back now. Elena moved toward the door, her footsteps hesitant, but determined. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, and for a brief moment, she considered running, escaping into the night, away from the treehouse. But something held her there, something deeper than fear. The figure had claimed her. It had tried to make her its own. But she had fought back. She had survived. And for some reason, she knew that the fight wasn't over. Not yet. She opened the door, the cool night air rushing in, but she didn't step out. Instead, Elena turned back, looking at the treehouse one last time. The walls that had once felt like safety now felt like a cage. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a new thought began to form. Maybe she had to face whatever waited in the dark. Maybe there was no escape until she did. With a final breath, Elena closed the door behind her, stepping out into the rain-soaked world beyond the treehouse, unsure of what would come next, but knowing she was ready. The rain had softened, but the world outside was still shrouded in mist, the trees around her heavy with droplets that glistened like tears in the dim light. Elena stepped carefully onto the wooden steps of the treehouse, each creak beneath her feet echoing in the stillness of the night. Her breath came in uneven gasps, her heart still racing, but the cold night air seemed to steady her, grounding her once more. The storm had passed, but the night was far from peaceful. There was a strange weight in the air, a sense of something lingering just out of reach, something not quite right. The trees seemed to whisper in the breeze, their branches swaying with an eerie rhythm. And still, the feeling of being watched, the heavy presence of something just beyond her sight, clung to her, more real than ever. She wasn't sure where to go. The treehouse was behind her, a place that had once offered her a sense of safety. But now it felt like a prison, a dark memory she couldn't outrun. Her feet moved on their own accord, stepping carefully into the thick undergrowth at the base of the tree. The forest around her was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the faint whisper of the wind, but there was something else, too. Something unnatural. A crackling, like static in the air, followed her every step, making her nerves stand on edge. It was as if the forest itself was waiting, watching her. She paused, trying to steady her breath, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. Elena. Her name. It was unmistakable, clear in the night. But this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she whirled around, her eyes darting through the mist, searching for any sign of movement. But the forest was silent now. No wind, no sound of branches moving. Only the faint, pulsing hum of the darkness still hanging around her, filling her senses with dread. She was alone, or so it seemed. But then, something in the corner of her vision moved. A shadow. Something shifting between the trees, just beyond the reach of the pale moonlight. Her breath caught in her throat as her body froze, every muscle tensed in fear. It was there. The figure. Not just a memory now, but a tangible presence standing in the distance. Its tall frame loomed against the mist, its eyes gleaming like twin pools of blackness, staring directly at her. Elena's chest tightened. She should run. She should escape. But her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, her mind racing, but unable to find the courage to look away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her. "Don't be afraid," the voice came again, softer this time, a melodic whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You can't hide from me." And just like that, the world around her seemed to bend and twist again. The shadows grew darker, stretching longer than they should have, and the figure's grin, twisted and wide, expanded into a grotesque smile. Elena's instincts screamed at her to run. But the figure didn't allow her that choice. With a sudden, sharp movement, the shadows rushed forward, swallowing her in an instant. Her scream was lost in the dark. And everything went black. The darkness engulfed her entirely, a suffocating blackness that stole every ounce of sound and light. Elena felt as though she had fallen through a crack in reality, slipping deeper and deeper into a place that existed outside of time and space. Her heart pounded in her chest, but the beat was faint, like a distant echo. She was weightless, suspended in the void, unable to move, unable to breathe freely. The world had vanished, leaving only the feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was circling her, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to surrender. And then, the voice came again. It wasn't the figure this time, but something else, something darker, older, and infinitely more menacing. "You thought you could escape," it rasped, its voice reverberating through her very bones. Elena's skin prickled at the sound, her body trembling in the silent void. But the voice was inside her now, swirling in her mind, twisting her thoughts. "Did you really think you could fight what is inescapable?" She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. Her chest ached, her lungs burning with the effort to force air into her body. But all that surrounded her was emptiness, pure, unrelenting emptiness. And yet, the pressure kept growing. It was like something was trying to crush her, something unseen but very real, tightening its grip around her throat. The darkness pressed in, suffocating her, until she couldn't tell where the void ended and she began. "Let go," the voice whispered. "It's already too late." She felt it then, something sharp, something cold, sliding into her chest, like icy fingers wrapping around her heart. The sensation was unbearable, but it wasn't just physical. It was a feeling of being torn apart from the inside out, as though every part of her being was being ripped away. Her breath hitched as the pain intensified, spreading like fire through her veins. But it wasn't just pain, it was the loss of herself, of her very identity. It was the feeling of becoming nothing. And then, suddenly, she was no longer in the void. She was somewhere else, somewhere familiar, yet wrong. The landscape shifted, forming into the treehouse again, but it wasn't the same treehouse she had known. It was warped, twisted, and the air was thick with a palpable, oppressive force. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, breathing in time with her ragged breaths. And standing in the center of the room, beneath the flickering lantern, was the figure once more. But now, its features were more defined, more grotesque. Its eyes, black and endless, stared at her with an expression of utter contempt. "Welcome back," it hissed, its voice sharp and cruel. Elena's legs gave way beneath her as the weight of the presence crushed her once again, forcing her to her knees. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't escape. And she realized, with growing horror, that it was true. She was trapped. Trapped in this nightmare that had no end, no mercy. The treehouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and she was its prisoner, caught in the endless cycle of darkness and despair. Her mind screamed for release, but it was futile. The figure leaned closer, its cold breath brushing against her ear. "You belong to me now, Elena," it whispered. And as the final remnants of her will slipped away, she knew that she had already lost. The figure's presence loomed over her, suffocating her every breath. The darkness that surrounded her seemed to close in tighter, as if the very walls of the treehouse were drawing her into its cold, endless void. Elena's eyes flickered, struggling to focus as the weight of the figure's gaze pressed down on her, anchoring her in place. The coldness of its breath swept over her, its words an icy caress against her skin. "You can fight all you want," it murmured, its voice slithering through her mind. "But it's futile. You were always mine." The chilling certainty of those words sank deep into Elena's soul, each syllable like a nail in her coffin. Her limbs were heavy, unresponsive, as if the very essence of her being had been drained away. The treehouse was no longer a place of refuge. It had become a tomb, a prison from which there was no escape. Her heart raced, but it felt distant, as though it was no longer her own. Her breaths came shallow, labored, the weight of despair pressing down on her chest. Her mind screamed for an answer, something, anything, to break free of this nightmare, but there was no answer. No way out. The figure leaned closer, its black eyes glowing in the dim light, locking her in a gaze that seemed to stretch for eternity. "You thought you could defy me," it whispered. "But I am inevitable. I am the end of all things." Elena's world began to blur at the edges, her vision narrowing as the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel. She could feel herself slipping, falling, fading into the darkness that had consumed her. Her thoughts, once sharp, were now dull and sluggish, as if the very essence of who she was being drained away with each passing second. And still, the figure's presence hovered above her, suffocating, watching, waiting. "You are nothing," it hissed, its voice sharp like a blade. "You will be forgotten, just like the rest." Her pulse quickened again, but it felt like the final beat of her heart, slipping away. She closed her eyes, tears stinging her lashes, but they were tears of resignation now. There was nothing left to fight for. Her body trembled, caught in the final throes of surrender. And as the darkness consumed her completely, Elena felt her very soul being pulled from her body. There was no pain, only an eerie emptiness, a sense of utter detachment. Her body, her memories, her thoughts, they all slipped away into the void. The figure smiled, its sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light, as Elena faded into nothingness. And in that moment, as she was swallowed whole by the darkness, she knew there was no escaping what had claimed her. It was over. But just as the last remnants of her being seemed to dissolve into the darkness, a sudden, unexpected sensation surged through her. It was like a crack of light in an endless expanse of black, a pulse of warmth that pushed against the cold. A whisper, no, a shout, broke through the suffocating void. Elena! Her name, sharp and clear, echoed like a beacon in the endless night. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then the voice came again, stronger, more insistent. Elena! Fight! It wasn't the figure. It was something else. Someone else. A force, a presence that she had almost forgotten in the crushing despair that surrounded her. The pressure around her chest loosened, just a fraction. A spark of something familiar, stirred deep within her. It was the memory of herself, of who she was before the darkness took hold. She felt it, the tiniest flicker of hope, of defiance, and it was enough. Her mind grasped onto that spark with everything it had, clinging to it as the shadows around her threatened to swallow her whole. The figure snarled, its presence tightening once more, but the voice continued. You are stronger than this. Don't let it take you. Elena fought with all her remaining strength, forcing her limbs to move, forcing her mind to reject the darkness. The air around her crackled, the suffocating grip of the void weakening as she summoned every ounce of her will. The figure recoiled, its twisted grin faltering for just a second. You can't, it began, but the voice in her mind interrupted it. Louder now. You are not its puppet. Elena's chest heaved as the grip of the dark figure slipped even further. She could feel the darkness beginning to retreat, unwilling to fight against the strength that had rekindled within her. The shadows, once so thick and inescapable, now trembled, flickering like the last embers of a fire that had almost gone out. Her body, weak and trembling, slowly rose from the floor of the treehouse, her feet finding the ground beneath her once again. The figure growled, its form flickering like a mirage, but its presence was no longer as overpowering. Elena's breathing steadied, her senses sharpening. The storm outside had calmed to a soft drizzle, and the mist in the air began to dissipate, just as the darkness around her began to fade. You don't belong here, Elena whispered, her voice stronger than she had ever imagined. The figure snarled, but its power was slipping, its form losing substance, like smoke dissipating into the wind. With every step Elena took toward it, the figure shrank, its form retreating further and further into the shadows. And then, with one final, defiant cry, the darkness was gone. The treehouse was quiet again. Elena stood in the middle of the room, trembling but alive, her heart still beating fiercely in her chest. The figure was no more, and in its place, there was only the soft sound of the rain outside, the gentle rhythm of nature returning to its natural state. She was free, but the question lingered in her mind. For how long? The air in the treehouse felt different now, lighter, as though the oppressive weight that had gripped her was finally lifting. But the silence was unnerving, stretching on longer than it should have, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Elena stood there, her body still trembling, her senses raw, as she tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The shadows had receded, but their presence lingered, like a memory that refused to fade. Her eyes darted around the treehouse, scanning every corner, every darkened nook. For a moment, she half expected the figure to reappear, to come rushing out of the shadows with its grotesque smile and its unrelenting hunger. But the room remained still. The soft drizzle outside tapped gently against the wooden windows, and the lantern flickered quietly in the corner, casting its warm glow over the room. Elena breathed a sigh of relief, though it was shaky and uncertain. She had won, but she could feel that something still wasn't right. The figure was gone, yes, but it had left its mark on her. A deep, lingering unease twisted in her gut, reminding her that the battle might have been won, but the war wasn't over. The darkness had touched her in ways she didn't fully understand. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something had been altered in the very fabric of her existence. Elena moved slowly, cautiously, her steps soft on the creaky floorboards. She walked toward the window, her hand trembling as she brushed aside the curtain. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the darkened forest outside, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But there was something different about the landscape. It felt off, like the very earth had been rearranged. The world beyond the treehouse no longer looked familiar. There was a strange, distorted quality to it, as if the shadows hadn't fully released their grip. The trees loomed taller than they had before, their branches stretching unnaturally toward the sky. The air itself seemed to ripple with energy, crackling in a way that felt unsettling. Elena stepped back from the window, her breath catching in her throat. Had she changed? Had the very nature of the world around her shifted when the darkness had been driven back? She didn't know, but she knew one thing for certain. The night was far from over. The storm had passed, but the stillness was deceptive. The darkness wasn't gone completely. It had simply retreated for now. Elena knew she had to stay vigilant. She couldn't let her guard down. Not when she had seen what she had seen. Not when she knew what had lurked in the shadows. The figure might be gone, but its influence had seeped into the very fabric of her world. She had survived the worst, but the real test was just beginning. Elena took one last, long look at the window, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. And with one final, steadying breath, she turned away from the window, determined not to let the darkness win again. Her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Elena's footsteps echoed softly through the treehouse, each one a reminder that she was still here, still standing. But the uncertainty that clung to the air was undeniable, as if the very walls of the treehouse were breathing with her, holding their secrets just out of reach. She had faced the darkness. She had fought it with everything she had. But the world around her had changed. She could feel it, deep in her bones, like the earth itself had shifted, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The faint sound of the wind rustled through the trees outside, a reminder of the life that still continued beyond the confines of the treehouse. But to Elena, it sounded hollow, distant, as though she had been separated from the world she once knew. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered, not just in the physical world, but in her soul, where the remnants of what had happened still gnawed at her. The shadows were no longer an external threat, but an internal one, something that she would carry with her forever. As she walked around the treehouse, her eyes scanned the walls, looking for anything out of place, anything that might betray the stillness she tried so desperately to hold on to. But everything appeared as it should, quiet, untouched. Except for the lantern. The flickering light was softer now, almost as if it, too, were hesitant to fully illuminate the room. Elena stood before it, mesmerized by the dance of the flames, which seemed to waver in a rhythm she couldn't understand. Then, a sound broke through the silence. A knock, soft, tentative, almost imperceptible. Elena's body tensed, her heart skipping a beat. The knock came again, this time louder, more deliberate. Her eyes flicked to the door, and her breath hitched in her throat. Who could it be? Had someone found her? Her mind raced, but her body moved before she could fully process the question. She approached the door slowly, each step heavier than the last, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cool, wooden surface. Another knock. Closer this time. Elena hesitated. Was it just the wind? Was the treehouse groaning under the strain of the night storm? Or was something or someone outside, waiting to re-enter her life? Taking a deep breath, she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the mist-covered trees and the eerily quiet night beyond. Elena stepped forward, her gaze sweeping the darkness, searching for anything that could explain the knocks. There was nothing. Just the swirling mist, the distant whisper of wind through the branches, and the ever-present feeling of being watched. She was about to close the door when a movement caught her eye. A figure, dark and shadowed, standing just at the edge of the forest. It was impossible to make out its features, but the shape was unmistakable. The figure was tall, its form blending into the night, like a part of the shadows themselves. Elena's heart skipped a beat. No, not again. Her breath quickened as she stepped back, the door still open, the figure just a few steps away from vanishing into the trees. But before she could react, the figure spoke, its voice a soft whisper carried by the wind. Elena. Her name. It wasn't the voice of the figure she had faced before. This voice was familiar, strangely so. It was the voice of someone she thought she had left behind. Someone she hadn't heard from in years. Elena, it's time to come home. Her hands went cold, her body trembling as she stared at the shadowy figure. Her voice called again, this time with more urgency. Elena, don't turn away. It's time. You know it's time. Her pulse raced, and she was frozen, rooted to the spot. The mist around the figure swirled, and for a brief moment, Elena thought she saw something she recognized, a face, a memory from long ago. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving only the shadow and the call of her name. She couldn't tear her eyes away. And then, just as her mind screamed for her to run, the door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in once again. Elena stood frozen in place, her hands still on the door handle, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows outside shifted as if alive, the figure's presence hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The familiar voice, echoed in her mind. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command. A plea. Elena, come back. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what was happening. The figure outside, calling to her, had felt too real, too close. But the door had slammed shut, and now she was alone, once again in the dim, flickering light of the treehouse. The mist outside thickened, creeping up the windows like fingers trying to pry open the door. The air in the room felt charged, vibrating with something unseen, something unsettling. The lantern's light flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls as though mocking her attempts to feel secure. Come home, Elena. It's time. The words replayed in her mind, over and over, a constant echo that gnawed at her thoughts. The voice was too familiar. She could almost see the face that it belonged to, the face she hadn't seen in years. Her stomach twisted in knots as the realization settled in. This wasn't just the darkness trying to drag her back. It was something more personal. Someone she had left behind, someone whose shadow had been cast over her even in the moments when she thought she was free. She backed away from the door, her breath shallow. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Her pulse quickened as the weight of the situation settled on her. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't something she could just wake up from. The voice was right. It was time. But the question lingered, time for what? Time to return? Time to give in? A shiver ran down her spine as she heard a creak from the floorboards beneath her. Something was shifting. Something was waking up. Her feet felt like lead as she turned toward the center of the treehouse. The walls groaned, the very foundation of the room seeming to stir, like it, too, was being called into action. She couldn't fight it anymore. The time had come. Elena's feet moved on their own, her body compelled by an unseen force. She didn't want to go, didn't want to answer the call of the voice that haunted her. But the pull was too strong, the pressure too relentless. Every inch of her mind screamed to resist, but her legs carried her toward the door, toward the darkness outside. The lantern light wavered weakly behind her, casting long, trembling shadows on the wooden walls of the treehouse. She stepped outside, into the mist that now enveloped the forest like a living thing. The air was thick, saturated with a cold that cut through her like a knife. The wind whispered through the branches, but the voice that called her name, was louder now, louder than the wind, louder than her own thoughts. Elena, it was like a song, soft and pleading, pulling her forward. Her heart raced, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was the acceptance of something greater. The fog around her parted, and through it, she saw the figure again, standing just beyond the reach of the treehouse's light. It was the same figure from before, but now it was clearer, more distinct. She could see its face. It was someone she once knew, someone who had been lost to her, someone whose absence had haunted her for years. The figure reached out to her, their expression tender, but sad, as though they too had been waiting for this moment. "Elena, it's time," the figure said again, their voice wrapped in the weight of inevitability. Tears stung Elena's eyes as she took a step closer, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to let go, didn't want to face what this moment meant. But in her heart, she knew it was time to return, to face the truth, to let go of the fear that had kept her trapped in the treehouse in the past. As she reached out to the figure, the mist around her began to dissolve. The forest, the treehouse, the darkness, they all faded away, replaced by a quiet peace. The figure smiled at her, their hand gentle in hers. And with that, Elena finally understood. She had fought, she had resisted, but some things were meant to be embraced. The darkness had never been her enemy. It had been the way home all along.